Welcome to the Pathfinder Legacy Podcast, where we help farmers, ranchers, and business owners create a seamless transition plan for the future. From retirement to ownership transfer, we protect what you've built and guide you every step of the way.
Hello, all. Welcome back to the Pathfinder Legacy Podcast. I'm your host, Heidi Olson, and we are back for part 2 of my conversation with Mr. Pete Hanebutt. Pete was telling us earlier about his background, his history, and the life that he's built with his wife, Diane, and his 2 sons. And Diane, unfortunately, had an unfortunate turn with her health. And during that time is when you guys learned of some things and just what you really need to do to better prepare for the future going forward. So last time, Pete, you just started to talk about after Diane passed and what you discovered and how you handled those next few days.
Yeah, it's an interesting transition, the way you get thrown into it. And even though, we knew that Diane was in declining health and all that, and knew that she wasn't going to survive, you still can't plan for everything. And so just the simple things like having utility bills and other things and making sure that they're in your name or both your names or whatever, those little things can solve some problems for you so that you're not finding out about something after you've already not paid a bill or whatever it is. Obviously we had a P.O. box that everything was coming to, so it's not like mail was going to 2 different places or anything. But just to go into the bank and say, look, my wife has passed away, so we need to take her off as account and just have me on it. The utilities, the same kind of thing, where we were on everything. She was on one and I was on another one. Had to fix all those kinds of things. But just those little things that you can do for yourself ahead of time that you just don't think you have to plan for, but they can rear their ugly head. And in my case, there was some planning involved because we knew Diane's mortality was coming up. But in other cases, you could lose your spouse just by a lightning strike or whatever it is. And if you don't have some things in place, you can really open yourself up to a lot of challenges if you don't think ahead as a couple and as a family. And so we were fortunate in that regard. I have a brother who's also widowed. He and his wife set all their stuff into a life estate so that it can't be changed. If he finds someone and remarries, why that person is not going to be involved with the stuff that is in the life estate for his daughters. But if he may go the rest of his life as a widower, and that may not change anything. But that's just one of the things that I've noticed that he had set in place before his wife passed away. And we just didn't think about those kinds of things. And so we've learned lessons, I guess, the hard way.
So now you've discovered, you made those contacts with the banks, with any of the utility bills and so forth, and taking care of all that. And you've got your affairs in order. What was one of the next things that was going through your mind that you needed to take care of?
Right. Well, dealing with the lawyer with closing her estate and all that kind of stuff, I have a good relationship with the family attorney. And so I told them, after we closed her estate officially and everything, that let's draw up a will for me. And I had a good talk with my boys about what kind of things that I have as toys, basically, that they might want to inherit. And it was mostly, things like shotguns and other stuff. And then I had a talk with them about, if I was hit by a bus tomorrow, here's what you should do with my 401k type of stuff. But just sitting down with your family and having a good talk with them, you may not be able to make everybody happy, but at least you've had the talk and had the basic conversation so they know what your intentions are. And I think that was healthy for us. And so my attorney, when he was drawing things up, he said, make sure you're pretty clear on what's what, because we've had families that have squabbled over the silliest things. You don't need to break up family dynamic over a Craftsman wrench, but that kind of thing can happen. And so we made sure that we had those things well defined, all put into stuff. But the boys are co-executors of my estate. I have 2 boys. And so they're co-executors, so they have to get along in settling my estate someday. Hopefully it'll be a long way off. But just making sure that those things are at least set down somewhere and that they know where my will is in the fireproof safe so that if, something should happen to me tonight, tomorrow, or whenever, that they're at least prepared for it and they understand that. And they both know who the attorney is because we have a connection from church and all. And so that makes it a little easier if you have that kind of situation. But that was something that I thought, I don't want to leave the boys in the lurch. I need to plan for them. And if you love your kids, you'll do those kinds of things, I think, for them instead of leaving a mess for them. And so having that well charted out and what goes where and what needs to be prioritized and that kind of stuff. I remember when my dad's oldest sister passed away and I was the executor for her estate. And she made it perfectly clear, take 20% of all my assets and give it to the church because they're going to need a new roof. And that paid for a lot of the roof at St. Augustana. That's just the way it was. And, we made sure that even though I was the executor, I made sure that all the family was involved in those decisions so that they felt comfortable with it. And I think that communication is really important. And sometimes people don't want to talk about this kind of thing. And it's really frustrating for me, knowing what I've been through and others in the family, that people don't want to talk about it. And I think it's probably because they don't want to face their own mortality. And I take a completely opposite view of it now. I think it's an opportunity for me to reinforce with everybody who's watching, my boys and anyone else, that this is part of my faith, that I know someday I'm going to pass on. If I live my faith, I'm going to go to heaven and be reunited with Diane and all my other loved ones. And I should be able to have that peace of mind by planning ahead and understanding all these things and having a plan. Obviously, God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit have a plan for me, and I'm not going to get out of this world alive. And so having some kind of plan for what happens to my assets gives me peace of mind. And I think it's a way that you could actually show your faith by doing it the right way, understanding that, we're all mortal and this is going to happen eventually and you need to have a plan. Those that don't have a plan for this kind of stuff end up causing more anxiety for their family. If you love your kids, why would you put them through that? Why not get it settled ahead of time so everybody can be happy? And if there are disputes over things, at least you can get them settled while you're all there to talk about it, rather than having to say one kid say, well, I know Dad would have wanted me to do this, or Dad would have wanted me to have that. And, having those things settled long ahead of time. I don't want my kids to have a family falling out because they want to argue over who gets the anvil, or something mundane like that. But it can happen in families. And I've heard those horror stories, and a lot of people probably have. So just plan ahead so that you don't have challenges and you don't leave challenges for your family once you're gone.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you make some very good points. I've seen all kinds of situations happen with my past experience with that, working with families and so forth. But I mean, you folks, Pete has just said these straight up what we really need to do and how important that communication is. And these things that you've heard me talk about many times on my podcast, that communication and documentation and where you're putting those important life documents, and then making sure you're communicating that with your family. Yeah, sure, you can leave it off the table and not share that information with them, but why not? Why not tell them up front ahead of time? So then if they have questions to ask, they can ask questions. And your boys probably did ask questions. Okay, Dad, what are your thoughts for these guns or whatever with the house that you are wanting to do what your wishes to be carried out? And then there was no questions, no rock left unturned.
Yeah, you don't want any surprises while your kids sit around the conference room at your lawyer's office reading your will. You don't want any surprises that cause them to, have a private falling out, to cause anxieties. And it gets more complicated. Neither of my boys are married. When they have spouses, we'll have to cross that bridge and have that communication. So the more people are involved, the more complicated it can be. But in reality, I think my boys will choose wisely with spouses and have a wife who's the salt of the earth, just like their mother was, and it'll all work out just fine. But family communication is really important. And historically in my family, we had a situation 3 generations ago where it didn't go that well. My great-great-grandfather treated his children differently. There were 4 kids in that family. He treated the older 2 differently than he did the younger 2. And it could have caused a lot of family ill will and a falling out and all that. And That generation got along, those four and their spouses got along pretty well. But what that did in our family was those cousins that were the next generation, they treated each other graciously all of their lives because their parents didn't get along. And they broke that cycle and made it better. And God bless them for doing it. My dad's generation, his sister and all their cousins got along beautifully all their lives and treated each other really well just because they saw that their parents didn't. And they learned from that lesson. And I don't see any reason why families need to go through that kind of stuff. But they do occasionally. There's personalities and there's people that want one thing or another and they have different views on life and different views on the afterlife. And sometimes it can cause problems. But if you and your nuclear family, your children and your spouse and whatever have those adult conversations ahead of time, you just save yourself so much trouble. And you don't check out of this world with the anxiety of knowing maybe I've left my kids a headache or maybe I've left my spouse a heartache by not taking care of these things ahead of time. And so you can lower your own anxiety by doing things the right way ahead of time.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree. And I think it's that those cycles, I think you bring up another great point is we pass down the same type of personality traits and so forth from generation to generation. And if there's something that hasn't been in line right with the way good characteristics and so forth, like you've talked about with that family, why not break that cycle and make sure that you're doing for the peace and the good of the order to make sure that you are able to carry on good family legacy.
Sadly, these are pretty old stories. I mean, it goes back to Cain and Abel, two brothers that didn't quite get along, and other examples from the Bible that I'm sure we're all familiar with where siblings didn't get along for whatever reason. And in one way, that's why we have two of the major religions of the world, Islam and Christianity, or Islam and Judaism, that follow two patriarchs that were brothers that couldn't get along. And isn't it a shame that we're still fighting some of these things in the world, that we're just a family squabble and we owe it to ourselves and our successive generations to not cause those kinds of things. Obviously, we won't have the West Bank Palestinian Israeli thing within my family, but those kinds of things came from that old of a family squabble. And why in the world are we doing that kind of stuff to each other still?
Right. Let's move forward and put those things behind us.
Break that cycle.
Yep, yeah. That's exactly right. So when you talked to your boys about this and sat down with them, how did you start that conversation with them? Because that's not always easy to, after losing their mother and having
a lot of drama involved with that, with her family's wishes versus what our family wanted, her distant relatives and what they thought was the right thing to do versus what the boys and I and what Diana talked about, previous to her aneurysm. It was a lot of anxiety. But once that was all settled, then sitting down with the boys and saying, we need to have an adult conversation. And it was basically us sitting around the living room after church and lunch one Sunday saying, here's what I'm going to do. I need to talk to you guys about this kind of stuff. We're going to make sure that this is all planned out. And they were not only appreciative. Now, granted, at first it's like, Dad, don't make us talk about you dying someday because we just lost our mom. And so that was, timing won't be good on that ever. But since it was fresh in our minds, it was good to talk about it. And afterwards, they were very appreciative that we actually had a plan instead of having to worry about winging it. And so having a plan for that kind of stuff was pretty important. My oldest boy right now knows, if I got run over by a bus tomorrow, he knows these bills need to be paid at this time of the month and these bills need to be paid this time of the month. I've almost, even as a grumpy old man, I've almost gone to direct withdrawal of all my bills, even though I still like the process of writing out checks. Other than tithing for church, I've almost gone to direct billing and everything. So that sort of takes care of itself. But we had that talk too about, these kinds of simple things. If I'm in the home somewhere and can't communicate, here's what I need you to do. And you need to think about this ahead of time. That kind of stuff. Those conversations may not be easy, but it's a lot easier to have those conversations ahead of time than to have to struggle through them when, if I was in a coma and couldn't communicate or worse. That's a lot harder. And so take that burden off by having those maybe sort of tough communications and tough talks now. But in reality, once you get the door open and start the conversation, it rolls along. From the experience we've had with Diane's passing, it rolls along pretty well. and a little bit of a whistling in the graveyard. We can laugh about it as we talk through it versus, being scared to have that conversation.
Right. Right. So, then that's just a sigh of relief for them, something they can make sure that you're well taken care of if there should ever be an incident that happens, and not have to stress and worry, where are the bills at? Where are the funds to pay those bills? What were Dad's wishes?
Yeah. And they know who my life insurance agent is and all that. And they also know that my retirement fund is set aside with this group and whatever. And I've talked to them about the smart thing for you to do would be, live your own lives and just let my retirement fund roll over, because it'll grow so fast as much as in it that you'll retire young and have lots to live off of from what your mother and I have left you, And so those kinds of things can be a healthy conversation to have. And so I think that's good. It did, particularly the younger son, maybe wanted to say, Dad, let's not have this conversation. I don't want to face it. And it's like, no, we have to, We don't want to go through this. You guys don't need to go through this without me being here to talk about it. And so let's just go through it. And so it was useful, and it was easy to do after we started the ball rolling. Then it was always easier to, talk about some things and then go back to it. We'd already opened the door, and we could go back to it, and we could polish up the conversation and talk about a few other things that we need. What have I forgotten to talk about? What kind of things do you have questions about? And so those kinds of things take care of themselves if you are willing to have the conversation.
Those conversations are never easy, but they are definitely necessary. And it's so important that you have done that, so you can your boys already know. And as life changes, as they get married or move on with their careers and so forth, they already have that knowledge of what your expectations are.
Yeah, it's never easy, and their lives are going to change a lot in the next 40 years. Well, I'm not going to be here for all of that. And so I'm trying to set them up in a way that however their life changes with spouses and, heaven forbid, with, maybe divorces or whatever it is, that this part of their life is not going to change, and the carpet's not going to get yanked out from under them, in that I want them to inherit these things, and including whatever's left over in my 401k and all that kind of stuff. And whatever they do in their own private lives as they become young adults and move on with their lives and have their own families and their own kids, this part of it is going to be stable for them. And it's going to be set in stone, as it were, as much as we can, the way that they understood it to be as of that date, And so I think that's healthy for families to do. They're probably not going to be in business together, but they may have cattle together or something like that. And that's a different situation than what we have within this household right now with, if I could put them under my roof, as it were, but just what's going to happen with my long-term plans and how that impacts them. Having that conversation, even as maybe uncomfortable as the first one was, which wasn't too bad. I don't think you could have rocked my boys any more than losing their mother and all the things that went on with that, with their brain injury. Things happen for a reason, I guess, and it was part of God's grace that since we had the tough things happen in our lives, it's a little easier to talk about my mortality because they were used to it with losing our mother. We don't want to go through that again, and I don't want anybody to have to go through what we did, but it was fresh in their mind, so maybe it was easier to talk about. And so there's never a good time, but it worked out. And you can't be so scared of having the conversation that you cause more problems by not having the conversation.
Did you think that after you had that conversation with both of the boys that Paul just graduated from college, he's just starting out his career, that him and Parker as well will make sure that they've got their own plans done in order?
I hope at least I'm showing them a good example. And when Diane and I were young married couple, less than 30, we would have never thought about that. And it's kind of amazing that if something had happened to one of us back then, I don't know how the other one would have handled it, how it would have been, managed. Obviously, we had life insurance and stuff like that. But if we'd had that conversation when we were 30, maybe we even would have forgotten about it by the time things happened with her. But that might have been a little easier for us, But it's never too early to have that conversation as a family. Granted, you don't want to scare your 6-year-old kids by saying this might happen. But when they get to be young adults and old enough to handle those kinds of things, maybe you just have those conversations, at least in a lighthearted way. And then it becomes easier as you talk about it more. My father-in-law is a good example of, he found that he had a terminal illness and there was no recovery from it. And some people were saying to him, it felt like, like the old baseball thing, like got a bad break. And he said, no, I do consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth because I had time to plan. I had time to get all my ducks in a row so that Shirley, my mother-in-law, Shirley didn't have to worry about these things. I had it all planned out. We had an older guy at our church in Indianapolis that did the same thing. He was retired military, and at the funeral, I remember I said to his wife, "Is there anything I can do?" And she said, he had everything taken care of. He was an officer and a gentleman to the end, and he had a plan, and we knew what the plan was. And now the plan just goes forward and it works out. So sometimes those conversations may not be easy, but they're the right thing to do.
That's right.
And the most honorable thing you can do.
That's right. And that's definitely a good gift to give to your family. So that way
Absolutely.
They can go ahead and grieve for the lost loved ones, so forth, and not have to be stressed.
Yeah.
At the same time.
Grieving is hard enough. You don't need the anxiety on top of it. So yeah, absolutely.
That's right. Right. So, as you guys have gone through this as a family, it's brought you much closer. You spend lots of time with your boys now, and you guys have those things that you really enjoy doing together. And they're both here close by with you now. So you see that continue to grow that relationship with them and keep them close.
It's a wonderful threshold that parents, and we all cross this threshold, I think, where your kids stop being your dependents and your kids, and they become your young adult advisors that you happen to have the same genetic pool. And it's such a blessing. My boys are my advisors on almost anything technical. And they can come to me with advice. You go through that age with your kids when they're somewhere between 15, 16 and about 22, where sometimes they don't want to be seen with you. They don't want to admit that they might still need you for something. And then all at once they cross that bridge, and you do as a family, you cross that bridge where you become friends with a big age gap difference and the same genetics and a lot of things in common. But they become your friends, and you can advise them and they can advise you on various things because we all bring different skills to the table. And it's such a blessing as a family when you go across that bridge and you're able to have those relationships. It is funny when you think about the world doesn't change that much. And Mark Twain said 125 years ago, when I was 16, I was sure my father knew nothing. But by the time I got to be 25, I was surprised what the old boy had learned in a few years. Well, we all go through that with our children, where they don't want to be seen with you. They're embarrassed to be seen with you at a high school ball game or whatever it is. And then all at once they come out on the other side. And what a blessing that is. Well, if they're that close of friends with you, you can have these other tough conversations too. I think a lot of people do, but sadly some don't. And so I hope that this is a cautionary tale to tell people that, something could happen to your spouse that wasn't part of your life plan. And you ought to have your ducks in a row ahead of time to just lower the anxiety amongst your family.
Yeah, absolutely. Very good advice to have. So as we conclude today, and a powerful story that you've shared with us, Pete, on what you've dealt with and the frustrations and so forth, is there, if you were to give your boys, putting yourself in their shoes where you were at that time of their life, where they are now, their age, what would be that one piece of advice that you would give them?
Don't be afraid to plan ahead in all aspects of life, career-wise, but also in your family relationship. My boys are still young enough that they're dating and that kind of stuff. And I always tell them, find a girl that's as good as your mom and the salt of the earth, and that you share a lot of things like religion in common with and all those kinds of things. And so I think that those kinds of things make a lot of sense, that you plan ahead and you think strategically about certain things. Doesn't mean you have to be so compulsive that your life is rigid. It means that you're comfortable enough with yourself that you can have those conversations with your family. And I hope that my boys have a long-term view of investing when they're young so that they don't have that anxiety of financial worries as they get older. And I hope they have a long-term view of their own mortality and their spouses someday that they don't have that anxiety as they get older. So having a long view on things is pretty important, I think.
Okay. Yeah. Very, very good. All right. Well, you've given our listeners some great tips and some good advice today, words of wisdom, as well as what you would hopefully Paul and Parker are tuning in today and listening to those words of advice from their dads. If they're not, I'm going to make sure that they are listening.
Absolutely.
Make sure that I send it to them. So, well, very powerful story again. We appreciate you entrusting in us to share this story and just a piece into your personal life on which is so important for all of our listeners to hear and know that you're not alone, that it does happen, and what you really need to do to protect yourself from this, or what you could prepare for your family for.
You can't protect yourself from everything. We had a life plan, and that all got turned upside down with, I can't be mad at God. His choices for our lives is not something I'm going to debate or dispute. It just is, life threw us a curveball. I would have never thought I'd be 60 and widowed and trying to be both mom and dad to a couple of boys that are still young adults. They're young men that are out on their own, but they're still young adults. And so try to give them the kind of advice that I think she would and that I would in different things and all that. So, life's curveballs can come at you, and you need to have a plan if it goes awry. And so just thinking about those kinds of things, I hope people think about it in the right way, not be scared to think about it.
Right. Because you want to make sure that your family is taken care of and that their well-being is very important.
If you truly love them, you'll think about those things and not ignore them.
Absolutely. Sorry. All right. Well, thank you so much, Pete. I really appreciate your wisdom and your advice that you've given us today. It's much needed for all of our listeners. I hope everyone that is tuning in is also taking this advice and making sure that you're taking a look at your own family plans and making sure you're having those hard conversations. Because they're not easy, but they are warranted. Very important to have those hard conversations. So
it can be a blessing to your family.
That's right. Absolutely.
I think it's important for people to remember that the legacy they leave is to leave your kids in a good situation and not a mess of anxiety. And the best thing you can do is to plan so that you're not leaving your kids anxiety or a mess. And that's a great legacy that you leave for them, that they can look back when they're old and say, my mom and dad, my folks really had a good plan for us. And that was great. God bless them for that. And so that's the legacy we all leave. If you want to do it right, or if you want to leave your family a mess.
Right. Depends. What legacy do you want to leave?
The legacy you want to leave, you can build yourself if you think ahead.
Absolutely. Very good advice to have. All right. At the end of the day, make sure that you know what type of legacy you really want to leave.
Absolutely.
All right. All right. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in today. If you'd like to connect with me, you can find me at pathfinderlegacy.com, or you can continue to share and like my podcast episodes. Until next time, I'll see you between the ditches.
Thanks for listening to the Pathfinder Legacy Podcast, where your future is our focus. Be sure to subscribe, follow us on social media, and visit us at pathfinderlegacy.com to start building your transition plan today.